Hello and welcome to this NET English poetry talk through for the AQA Power and Conflict Anthology. Now today I'm going to be walking you through the context and the content for Ozymandias. Let's start off with a quick reading of the poem. So, Ozymandias. I met a traveller from an antique land who said, "Two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip, and sneer of cold command, tell that its sculptor well those passions read, which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them, and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal these words appear: My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away." Now, Percy Shelley, who lived from 1792 to 1822, was one of the most famous of what became known as the Romantic poets. Now, the Romantics were a group of poets in the 18th and 19th centuries who were very interested in nature, so they found a lot of their inspiration in the natural world. Now, the Romantics, while quite a varied group, tended to believe passionately in social justice and the rights of women in the working class. And they valued emotional experiences more, perhaps, than things like reason and rationality. Now, Shelley, who was an atheist, was particularly radical in both his poetry and in his views on society. His father was a knight, and Shelley did attend some of the best schools in the country before going on to university. Unfortunately, he was kicked out before finishing his degree, and that was due to his political and his religious views. He married relatively young, although the marriage didn't last, and Shelley then spent a lot of his adult life embroiled in various romantic and social scandals, something he shared with his close friend Lord Byron, though Shelley eventually became very dedicated to his second wife, Mary, who was the author of Frankenstein, and the couple spent much of their marriage travelling around Europe together. Shelley drowned, aged 29, when his boat capsized. Now, despite dying young, Shelley did go on to become a key influence on a wide range of later poets. Now, the Romantic poets generally moved away from British society's obsession with Greek and Roman culture, and they often looked instead to more Eastern cultures for ideas and influences. Now, Ozymandias is partially the result of this. Shelley was inspired to write the poem in 1817 after the British Library acquired the head and the torso of a statue of Ramesses II from Egypt, and that statue dated back to about the 13th century BC. Now, Ozymandias was the Greek name used for that pharaoh. Now, Ramesses II is probably the pharaoh described in the book of Exodus. He reigned from 1279 to about 1212 BC, and he was known as Ramesses the Great, or after his death, when he was about 90 years old, he was known as Ramesses the Great Ancestor. Now, Ramesses II was probably the powerful and the most successful of Egypt's pharaohs. He had a string of military successes, expanding the Egyptian empire and putting in place large-scale building works across Egypt. Shelley discovered that a Greek historian had described a huge Egyptian statue of the kind the library had acquired, and it also referred to the inscription on the statue, which said something along the lines of, "King of Kings, Ozymandias am I. If any want to know how great I am and where I lie, let him outdo me in my work." Now, Shelley was inspired by the mismatch between the vainglorious hubris of the statement and the reality of these fragments of the statue. And Shelley and one of his friends challenged each other to write competing sonnets about the same topic. Shelley's poem was published in 1818, and in keeping with the statue and the inscription, it explores the impact of time and the inevitability of history, presenting the idea that all things, no matter how powerful or important, they ultimately fade into nothing. Nothing's permanent, not kings, not empires, and everything we are and everything we do ultimately fades into oblivion and anonymity. If you're into popular culture, it's why the poem was quoted so widely in trailing that final season of Breaking Bad. It's also why one of the final episodes was called Ozymandias, and why also the character in Watchmen was named after him. Now, the poem is a sonnet, which is not a particularly unusual type of poem, although perhaps it's quite dated. There are a few possible reasons for this choice of form. For one, Shelley is writing a poem about an ancient statue and an ancient king, so using a rather old-fashioned poetic form and an old-fashioned style seemed like quite a neat fit. For another, the sonnet form is probably the most famous kind of English poem. It was popularised during Shakespeare's lifetime, and it was linked particularly to his literary legacy, although he didn't invent it. In fact, the sonnet actually came from Italy and was more or less invented by a different poet, Petrarch, though appropriately enough, people forget about that. Even the kind of sonnet that Shakespeare most commonly used was actually created by someone else, the Earl of Sussex, and yet we forget and call it a Shakespearean sonnet. In fitting with the old-fashioned verse form, Shelley has used more or less perfect iambic pentameter for the lines. So that's these 10-syllable lines with unstressed syllables followed by stressed syllables. Again, it's not unusual, but it is certainly associated with literary heritage and the past. The rhyme scheme, despite making the poem a sonnet, is a little unusual. So we have this rhyme scheme which is A, B, A, B, A, C, D, C, E, D, E, F, E, F. Now usually a sonnet divides fairly neatly into an 8-line section called an octet or an octave, and a 6-line section called a sestet. This one doesn't. In fact, it's hard to divide it up at all. The rhyme scheme is also complicated by some striking half rhymes. Stone and frown don't fully rhyme, with the same being true of, say, appear and despair. The half rhymes help to smooth out the rhyme scheme somewhat, preventing it from becoming too obvious, too obtrusive, which better fits the reflective, melancholic tone of the poem. The poem opens with the idea of the traveller from an antique land. Shelley's presenting the poem as if it's a semi-mythical traveller's story, an exotic tale of a far-off place. The distancing effect of this perspective is important. We're removed from the reality of Ozymandias by geography, by time, and by perspective. We're limited to this word-of-mouth report. The references to the traveller and the land being antique both link to the passage of time. However mighty this King of Kings may have been, time moves on, and we're all limited by space. King of Kings, while it does have other reference frames, is also a title used to refer to Jesus within Christianity. So if you see, for example, the first epistle to Timothy and the book of Revelations. In terms of Shelley's devoted atheism, it's possible that the poet here is actually predicting the decline and fall of European Christianity, possibly of organised religion as a whole. It's worth remembering that the statue from which Shelley drew his inspiration had existed around 13 centuries before Jesus of Nazareth had even been born, and yet this ancient power had crumbled to nothing. Empires, both temporal and spiritual, decline and die, the poet is suggesting. Now the remnants of the statue are worth considering. The legs may be vast, but there's no body attached to them, there's no trunk, no real substance. It's particularly ironic in terms of them being built of stone, something we think of as lasting, juxtaposed with the desert and the sand, which shift endlessly and erode whatever is there. The idea that the legs stand is worth noting. Time moves on, the traveller travels, but the legs stay the same. The past is unchanging. Now the visage being shattered represents the facelessness of the figure. This was someone powerful, someone used to being obeyed, as you can tell from their frown and their sneer of cold command. However, now their face isn't even complete, linked also to the idea of the statue itself being a representation of the figure. In an odd sort of way, the statue for the traveller is almost a parallel for the traveller to the narrator. The real king is represented by the statue for the traveller. The statue is then represented by the traveller for the narrator. We have no contact with the real figure, only a vague record of their representation. Now notice how the lines from near them to cold command are still iambic pentameter, but are divided by caesuras. There are breaks in the lines after them, lies, and lip. It's almost as if the fragmented lines and the list of features are being used to reflect the few remaining fragments of the past that are left behind. The passions read by its sculptor still survive, stamped on these lifeless things, with the juxtaposition of the passions and the lifeless stone fragments quite telling. Ultimately, there's no life left now, however vital the figure may have been when alive, with Shelley perhaps making the point that life and living are far more important and meaningful than things which are cold and static and dead, and that the statue perhaps better represents the artist, the sculptor's skill, rather than the actual figure, just as Shelley's poem is in many ways a better known and more permanent record of the statue than the stone fragments themselves. It's appropriate that the words should appear on the pedestal. We associate a pedestal not simply with somewhere to stand statues, but with fixing something to be admired, elevating something to the level of significance and meaning. There's an irony then to the words, "My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings, look on my works, ye mighty in despair." To the originator of the words, the intention is to boast about his absolute power and his significance in the world. The idea that we couldn't possibly compete with his power. Now, for an audience, we essentially interpret the significance of the imperative given as the exact opposite. Even this all-powerful figure, this King of Kings, with all his works, has come to nothing, has been forgotten, is left behind as the sporadic fragments rather than a permanent record. Now, as mentioned earlier, both King of Kings and the idea of a person's works resonate with biblical Christianity. In the book of Matthew, for example, readers are warned against false prophets, since from their works you shall know them. Now, for Shelley, anyone mighty looking at this statue should despair, because ultimately everyone will end up like the statue, broken, abandoned, and forgotten. As Shelley points out, nothing beside remains, with the finality of the full stop reinforcing this brutal truth. What is left round the decay of that colossal wreck is simply the lone and level sands stretching far away, a world that moves on without caring about the loss of this past, with the alliterated plosives on boundless and bare juxtaposing with the statue, which is now very firmly bounded, limited. Nature and the natural world are unlimited, Shelley seems to suggest, whereas humankind cannot help but be limited by time and space. It's worth considering Shelley's atheism here. For those who belong to one of the major world faiths, a key concept of most of them is the idea of heaven, of a comfort for the future, meaning after death, permanency. Unlike the simple and empty ending that Shelley seems to envisage here, where the world sees the body simply crumbling into dust. We are buried within the earth, and all that's left is nothingness, boundless and bare. It's also briefly worth thinking about the time that Shelley was writing. After the defeat of France in the Napoleonic Wars, Britain had established itself as the dominant power on land and sea. In fact, for much of the 19th century, Britain acted as a kind of global policeman, supervising what became known as the Pax Britannica, the British peace. In addition, during the 19th century, Britain was transformed by the Industrial Revolution. It gained control of much of India, of large parts of Africa, including Egypt, and the economies of much of Asia and South America through its trade dominance. Now, Britain governed, without question, the largest empire the world had ever seen. It was supremely confident in its foreign relations, pursuing a course of splendid isolation, secure in its military and its economic dominance across the world. Now, whether or not this is what Shelley had in mind when he wrote Ozymandias is hard to determine, but it seems a remarkable coincidence that Shelley should write a poem about hubris, about arrogance that seems to challenge the gods, just when Britain had become so dominant, so self-assured, and so apparently secure in terms of its empire. Now, from a modern perspective, it's also interesting to compare this to the kind of arrogance that embroiled Britain in much of the conflict that took place across Europe in the late 19th and early to mid-20th century, and also to consider the British Empire now, a loose confederation of Commonwealth countries, some lasting political problems, a few tiny islands dotted in odd locations across the globe, and a lasting sense of frustrated self-importance. As an interesting footnote, the statue of Ramesses II that inspired the poem was finally reassembled and was restored in 1955, and it still stands in Egypt. The finished statue was 11 meters tall and was placed on a 3-meter pedestal. However, it did have to be moved after the realization that traffic pollution was causing the stonework to erode, and there is, I think, an irony in there somewhere. In terms of links and comparisons to make across the AQA Power and Conflict anthology, the focus on permanence and impermanence, the natural and the human-made, links quite neatly with poems like My Last Duchess, especially with the focus on the dominating authoritarian power of both Ozymandias and the Duke. However, this also links us to poems like Tissue or Checking Out My History, Things Not Lasting, the relationship between representation and reality, and so on. The focus on human power and powerlessness in comparison to nature can also be seen in poems such as Storm on the Island or Exposure, but there are some interesting tensions that could also be explored in a comparison to a poem such as The Prelude or Kamikaze, perhaps. Thank you for listening, and don't forget that there's a range of other videos on the Power and Conflict poetry and on all the other GCSE English topics, and you can find those on the NET English YouTube channel, which is www.youtube.com/NETEnglish1.